Carlos Alcaraz is only 19 years old, yet he already has a Grand Slam title under his belt and is currently the #1 ranked tennis player in the world. He is the youngest player in the history of the sport to hold such a position, and many are quick to call him the next Rafael Nadal. Today, we'll be taking a look at this young Spaniard's historic rise to the top, so let's begin. First up, how did Carlos Alcaraz get his start? Alcaraz was born in 2003. I know, that sounds pretty insane. In Murcia, Spain. His father was the director of the local tennis academy in his small little town, so it was safe to say that Alcaraz was hitting tennis balls before he even learned how to walk. By the time Alcaraz was 10, he joined the International Juniors Tour, quickly rising up the ranks as one of the greatest kid tennis prodigies in the history of Spain. His first major tournament win came in 2018, when he became the European U16 champion. This was all thanks to some training that he had received from Carlos Ferrero, who remains Alcaraz's trainer to this day. Under Ferrero's wing, Alcaraz managed not to only win the U16 championship, but also become one of the most interesting prospects in the pro league. He would finally go pro later that year, but it wasn't until 2020 that he got his first ATP match. Up next, did Carlos have a good showing at his first ATP match? Carlos Alcaraz was not initially meant to play in the 2020 Rio Open. However, his name came up in a wildcard draw, and this ultimately became his first time to shine in front of a worldwide audience. While Alcaraz was a pretty dominant player in U16 matches, going head-to-head against the pros was going to be a lot more difficult for the then 16-year-old. Surprisingly enough, Alcaraz actually won during the first round against Albert Ramos Vinolas, one of the top 40 players in the world. This was a victory that absolutely no one saw coming, and it solidified Alcaraz's status as the young player to watch. In the second round, he lost against Federico Coria after a spectacular showing. No one expected Alcaraz to actually win the Rio Open at 16 years old, but the fact that he even managed to reach the second round is astonishing. The Rio Open was ultimately won by Christian Garin, one of the event's top seeds. Coming up, how did Alcaraz show his rise up the ranks? With his first ATP event ending in spectacular fashion, it was now time for the young Spaniard to focus on training and improving so that he could go head-to-head against some of the best players in the world. He received a lot of time off because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but that thankfully gave him even more time to train. He ultimately qualified for the 2021 Australian Open, making it his first ever Grand Slam event. The fact that Alcaraz was able to qualify for a Grand Slam event at the age of 17 was a remarkable feat in and of itself. Many adult players dream of such an accomplishment, yet this teenager had them all beat. His first opponent at the Australian Open was Botic van de Zandschulp, one of the top 50 players in the world. Surely this was not going to be an easy match for him, and even if he lost, he could go home knowing that he became one of the youngest people to ever qualify for a Grand Slam event. But once again, Carlos Alcaraz left the entire audience shocked as he beat his Dutch opponent in the first round. Later during the second round, Alcaraz lost to Mikael Ymer, but by now, it was clear that this young man was a once-in-a-lifetime talent. Sure, he wasn't old enough to vote, drink alcohol, or join the military, but he was still old enough to give some formidable tennis players a pounding of a lifetime. Next, how Carlos Alcaraz continued his monumental rise. Despite qualifying for a Grand Slam event, Carlos Alcaraz was still sort of seen as a little kid by many of the tennis world. Sure, he was good for his age, but is he really good enough to be among the best in the tennis world? But Alcaraz was on a mission to prove he wasn't Carlitos anymore. He was Carlos, a grown man capable of beating any big name in tennis. His next event would be the 2021 Madrid Open, and in the first round, he became the youngest winner in the history of the event by defeating Adrian Mannarino. The previous record was held by an 18-year-old Rafael Nadal in 2004, and this was only the beginning of the comparisons that fans and the media would make between the two. The second round of the Madrid Open took place on Alcaraz's 18th birthday, and his opponent was none other than the legend himself, Rafael Nadal. It came as no shock to anyone that Nadal ended up winning the match, but the fact that Alcaraz was able to play with the man he idolized for pretty much his entire life was a win in and of itself. Following this, Alcaraz entered his second Grand Slam event. After getting to go toe-to-toe against one of the greatest tennis players of all time, Carlos Alcaraz was ready to try his luck against his second Grand Slam event. He managed to qualify for the 2021 French Open by defeating numerous opponents from all over the world. During the first round of the French Open, Carlos defeated fellow Spaniard Bernabe Zapata Miralles. This was perhaps the first time in his career that a win wasn't shocking, just because we were so used to seeing him win at this point. What was surprising was that in the second round, Carlos won again by defeating Nicolas Basilashvili, reaching the third round of a Grand Slam event for the first time in his career. In the third round, however, Carlos lost to German player John Leonard Struff, but he won everyone's hearts by reaching this milestone. But that wasn't it for Carlos. Right after the French Open, Alcaraz also qualified for Wimbledon. He defeated Japanese player Yasutaka Uchiyama during the first round in a rather close matchup, and ended up up losing to legend Daniil Medvedev in the second round. He later qualified for the US Open, and this time around he reached all the way to the fourth round. This was the first time in 29 years that a teenager reached the quarterfinals of a Grand Slam event. He ultimately retired from the quarterfinal match against Felix Auger-Aliassime due to a leg injury. Fast forward a year later, and Carlos Alcaraz is at the top of the world. Between the 2021 and the 2022 US Opens, Carlos Alcaraz won 5 ATP Tour titles, including 2 Masters 1000 titles. He was one of the top 10 ranked players in the world at the age of 19, and this was finally going to be the Grand Slam event where he shines. By now, Carlos Alcaraz was definitely not a kid. He was a force to be reckoned with, a player with the ability to beat nearly everyone in the world. He beat Argentinian player Sebastian Baez in stunning fashion in the first round of the US Open. In the second round, he beat Chilean player Federico Coria, and in the third round, he beat American Jenson Brooksby. This was followed by 2 unexpected victories against Marin Cilic and Jannik Sinner, allowing the 19-year-old to reach the semifinals of the US Open for the first time in his career. In the semifinals, he defeated Francis Tiafoe, and now it was time for the biggest challenge of Alcaraz's life. He was set to face one of the best tennis players in the world, Casper Ruud, and ultimately, the 19-year-old overcame the odds and became the youngest winner of the US Open in history. He also became the #1 ranked player in the world, becoming the youngest player to reach the milestone. The future definitely seems bright for this young player. And finally, after all that, Carlos Alcaraz seems to be in a bit of trouble. Alcaraz's first tournament after the 2022 US Open was the Astana Open. He was the top seed of the tournament, obviously, and one of the favorites to take the title home despite some fierce competition. His first match was against Belgian player David Goffin, a man who isn't even in the top 50 of the tennis rankings. Everyone expected Alcaraz to win, but shockingly enough, he didn't. It was one of the greatest upsets in the history of tennis. And after the match concluded, Alcaraz admitted that he wasn't at the top of his game. He said that he wasn't able to handle the pressure that his Belgian opponent put on him and gave him full props for the win. But for now, the world #1 isn't doing too well. But don't let this distract you from the fact that Carlos Alcaraz is still only 19 years old. Roger Federer didn't win his first Grand Slam until he was 22, and Alcaraz has far outpaced some of the greatest players in the history of tennis. With some time, he might prove to be the next Federer or Nadal. And that's a wrap for this video. Do you think Alcaraz is going to stay at the top for long? Let us know in the comment section below. And as always, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more videos just like this. We'll see you in the next one.